In May of 1835, a man named William Ellison Jr. made an announcement that echoed through South Carolina's low country, like a bell tolling in a cathedral. He was sending his daughter Marjorie to study chemistry. Not the decorative arts, not music or languages or needlework, the approved curriculum for young women of her station. No, he was sending her to learn the composition of matter itself, the reactions between substances, the way that compounds could be combined to create specific effects. The announcement was made at a dinner party attended by the wealthiest families in Colleton County. William Ellison Jr. stood at the head of his mahogany table, candlelight flickering across his face, casting shadows that seemed to deepen the severity of his features. The dining room was oppressively warm despite the open windows, the kind of May heat that made the air itself feel solid, that made women fan themselves frantically and men loosen their cravats. William Jr. was not bothered by the heat. He was a man whose inner coldness seemed to repel the external world. "My daughter," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "possesses an unusual intellect. To waste such a gift on needlework and social pleasantries would be a tragedy. I have therefore arranged for her to receive instruction in the sciences, specifically in chemistry. A scholar from Charleston will come to Cypress Grove twice weekly to provide this education." The guests exchanged glances. One of the older women set down her glass of wine with deliberate care. A man near the far end of the table cleared his throat. Everyone knew that there was something deeply unusual about Marjorie Ellison. Everyone knew that she had suffered from a prolonged nervous complaint. Everyone knew that she had been confined to her room for extended periods, that she had been medicated heavily, that she had allegedly attempted violence against her father on at least one occasion. The fact that William Ellison Jr. was now proposing to educate her, to give her access to knowledge and intellectual stimulation, seemed contradictory to everything that had been said about her condition. But no one asked questions. In South Carolina society of the 1830s, you did not question the decisions of men like William Ellison Jr. He was wealthy. He was successful. He was a man of mixed race who had somehow navigated the impossible social landscape and become prosperous, which was an accomplishment that commanded respect, or at least the appearance of respect. So the guests smiled politely and said nothing, and by the next morning, the announcement had spread through the county like a contagion. "He is losing his mind," one woman said to another over tea. "The daughter is mad," another woman replied. "Everyone knows it. He is simply throwing money at the problem, hoping that education can accomplish what medicine has failed to do." Or, a third woman suggested quietly, "He is preparing her for something, some new scheme. You know William Ellison Jr. does not do anything without calculation." None of them were correct, and all of them were correct. The truth was more complex and far more dangerous than any of their speculation could reach. Cypress Grove Plantation sat 8 miles outside of town, on 800 acres of moderately productive land, carved from the low country marshes. The plantation house was an impressive structure, 2 stories with tall columns, a wraparound porch, windows with shutters painted dark green, a brick chimney at each end. It was not as grand as the homes of the truly wealthy planters, those monuments to excess that stood in the more prestigious areas of the region, but it was respectable. It was the house of a successful man. It was the house of someone who had climbed. The land around Cypress Grove was a study in contradictions. Rice fields stretched in every direction, their water channels precisely engineered, their dikes carefully maintained. These were the fields that generated wealth, thousands upon thousands of dollars extracted each year from marshland that should have been worthless. The extraction was possible only because of human labor, because of bodies moving through water up to their knees, working from dawn until dusk in conditions that bred malaria and yellow fever and dysentery. The Low Country had the highest mortality rate of any region in the United States. The enslaved people who worked the rice fields died at rates that would have shocked observers from other regions. This was accepted as simply the cost of doing business. Around the main house were various outbuildings, a kitchen house separate from the main residence for fire safety, a blacksmith's workshop, storage buildings for grain and tools. The quarters where the enslaved people lived, simple structures of wood and thatch, arranged in rows as regulated and controlled as a prison. There were 63 enslaved people at Cypress Grove. They ranged in age from newborn infants to elderly people in their 70s who had somehow survived decades of slavery. They were owned by William Ellison Jr., documented in his ledgers, assessed for value and productivity, bought and sold, or bred for increase as circumstances dictated. The cellar of Cypress Grove was the heart of the plantation in a way that the main house was not. It was here that the mysteries of the place gathered, that the true purpose of the plantation revealed itself. The cellar had a main chamber used for ordinary storage: wine, preserved foods, items requiring cool, dark conditions. But beyond the storage area, behind a carefully concealed panel in the brick wall, was another chamber. A chamber that existed for purposes that did not appear in any of William Ellison Jr.'s account books. A chamber that was used for gatherings that occurred only when darkness had fully fallen, when the enslaved people had been locked in their quarters, when any white person who might wander near the house could be explained away as indulging in late-night business or personal affairs. This chamber was the meeting place of the Brethren of the Harvest. The Brethren had been founded in the 1810s by a group of men who shared certain beliefs about power, about the natural order, about the proper relationship between the strong and the weak. They believed that power was something physical, something that could be generated through ritual and sacrifice. They believed that the land itself was alive, that it could be strengthened through blood offerings, that the fertility of crops and the prosperity of plantations could be enhanced through ceremonies that transcended conventional morality. Some of their beliefs came from European folklore, stories of witchcraft and magic that had been passed down through generations. Some came from African traditions that they had learned from the enslaved people they owned, then perverted into something darker, something that served their own purposes rather than the spiritual practices that had originated these traditions. The Brethren were not practitioners of any organized religion, though they often included clergymen in their membership. They were practitioners of power. They were men who had concluded that conventional morality was for the weak, that strength justified any act, and that ritual could transform cruelty into necessity. William Ellison Jr. had been initiated into the Brethren in 1822 when he was 32 years old and hungry for every form of power that could be accumulated. For 13 years, he had participated in their ceremonies. He had stood in that hidden cellar wearing robes marked with symbols, a scythe crossed with wheat stalks, representing both harvest and death. He had watched things that would have horrified ordinary men. He had participated in acts that would have condemned him to hang if they had ever been made public. And he had told himself that this was the price of being truly powerful, that this was the cost of transcending the limitations that bound lesser men. But the hidden chamber held one thing that William Ellison Jr. believed he had secured against all possibility of discovery. It held a ledger, a large book bound in red leather, locked with a small brass key, filled with his own handwriting. The ledger documented everything: the rituals, the dates and times, the names of the 13 men who made up the Brethren's core membership, the identities of the people who had been brought to the chamber, some willingly, some by deception, some by force, the specific acts that had been performed, the specific outcomes. It was William Ellison Jr.'s confession, his justification, and his eternal damnation, all bound in red leather and locked away in a place that he believed no one would ever find. He was wrong about that, just as he was wrong about so many things. Oh, Marjorie Ellison had been born in 1811, the daughter of William Ellison Jr. and his wife, Elizabeth Yancey. Elizabeth had been a practical woman, more interested in account books than in society, more concerned with profit margins than with fashion. She had given birth to Marjorie after 3 years of marriage, and the pregnancy and delivery had been difficult. When Marjorie was 3 days old, her mother had developed a fever. By the time Marjorie was a month old, her mother was dead. William Ellison Jr. had raised his daughter alone, with the help of enslaved servants, without remarrying. He had educated her with hired tutors. He had provided her with books and music lessons and training in the social graces. He had prepared her to be the wife of a successful man, though as she grew older and remained unmarried, he had begun to see her as something more complicated, an investment that had failed to generate the expected return. Everything changed when Marjorie was 12 years old. It was a summer evening in 1823, hot and humid, the kind of evening when the air itself seemed to press down on the land like a living thing. Marjorie had been playing in the garden near the main house when she noticed that her cat, a small black thing named Erebus, had gone missing. She loved that cat with the intense, uncomplicated love that children are capable of. She searched the grounds for it, calling its name, looking in the places where it might have taken shelter from the heat. Her search led her to the house, and then into the house, and then to the cellar door, which she found standing slightly ajar. The cellar was cool, a refuge from the oppressive heat above. She descended the stairs carefully, holding up the lamp that she had taken from the main floor, calling for her cat. She found Erebus in the outer chamber of the cellar, cornered in a wooden crate, hissing and spitting with terror. She reached down to pick him up, and as she was doing so, she heard a sound from deeper in the cellar. A rhythmic sound, a chanting sound. Marjorie's curiosity overcame her caution. She set the cat aside. It bolted immediately back toward the stairs and moved deeper into the cellar, toward the source of the sound. She found the hidden chamber. The false panel was open, and light spilled out into the main storage area. Marjorie approached slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster, some instinct warning her that she was about to see something that she was not supposed to see. What she saw would mark her for life. The chamber was large, lit by dozens of candles. 13 men stood in a circle, wearing robes marked with symbols. The robes were different colors, some black, some deep red, some a sickly purple. In the center of the circle was an altar, a wooden structure about waist high, stained with something that appeared to be rust or blood. On the altar lay a woman. She was restrained, her wrists and ankles tied to the wooden frame. She was wearing only a thin shift, which had been torn in places. Her eyes were wide with terror, and when she attempted to cry out, it became clear that her mouth had been stuffed with cloth and bound with rope. At the head of the altar stood her father. He was wearing a black robe, and he was holding a knife, not a small knife, but a large blade, the kind used for butchering meat. Marjorie watched in horror as her father raised the knife above his head. She watched as he brought it down. She watched as the woman on the altar convulsed with the impact. And then someone noticed her standing in the doorway. "The girl," one of the men said, pointing. The ceremony stopped. The chanting ceased. All 13 men turned to look at the child standing in their midst, her face pale, her small hands trembling at her sides. William Ellison Jr. set down the knife with deliberate care. He stepped down from the altar. He approached his daughter slowly, and when he reached her, he placed his hand on her shoulder, and his fingers dug into her skin hard enough to leave bruises. "Marjorie," he said quietly, "you should not be here." And then he led her back through the cellar, back up the stairs, back into the house, and locked her in her room. For 3 days she remained locked in that room. She was given food, but no explanation. She was given water, but no words. On the 4th day, her father came to her and told her something that would define the rest of her life. "What you saw," he said, "did not happen. You have a vivid imagination, Marjorie, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. You have confused a dream with reality. The woman you thought you saw was not real. The blood was not real. The ceremony was not real. None of it was real. You invented it all in your own mind." Marjorie tried to protest. She tried to tell him what she had seen. Her father listened patiently, and then he told her something else. "You are ill," he said. "You have a nervous condition. The doctors have confirmed it. Your mind is not reliable. It creates false memories. It interprets innocent events as dangerous ones. This is a medical fact, not a matter of opinion. You must accept this, or you will drive yourself mad." He then called in a physician, a man named Dr. Samuel Harrow, who prescribed medications for Marjorie's nervous condition. The medications were primarily laudanum, a tincture of opium that was commonly used for female complaints of anxiety and hysteria. But Dr. Harrow also prescribed compounds containing mercury and other medications whose exact composition was not entirely clear, even to the doctor himself. Within weeks, the laudanum and other medications had begun to do their work. Marjorie's mind became foggy. Her memories of what she had witnessed became confused with her father's narrative of what had never happened. The line between what she had seen and what she had imagined became increasingly blurred. And her father had won. He had secured her silence through a combination of medical intervention and psychological manipulation that was so effective that Marjorie herself began to doubt what she remembered. For 12 years, this continued. For 12 years, Marjorie lived in a state of pharmaceutical haze. She moved through the rooms of Cypress Grove like a ghost. She attended social functions when required, but she said very little. She occupied her days with needlework and reading, pursuits that did not require sharp thinking, pursuits that could be accomplished in a state of mental fog. She became the very thing that her father had told everyone she was, a woman with a nervous condition, a woman whose mind could not be trusted, a woman who was broken in ways that could not be repaired. And then, 6 months before her father's announcement about her chemistry education, something shifted. Marjorie had begun deliberately and carefully to reduce her intake of the medications that were supposed to be her salvation. She hid the laudanum beneath her mattress instead of drinking it. She wrapped the mercury compounds in cloth and buried them in the garden. She endured the physical symptoms of withdrawal, the sweating, the shaking, the moments of such intense anxiety that she could barely function. She pushed through it all because some part of her mind, the part that had remained intact despite 12 years of chemical suppression, was telling her that the fog was not protection. The fog was a prison. As her mind cleared, her memories sharpened. The things she had seen in that cellar became less like dreams and more like documented facts. She began to understand that her father had not been protecting her from madness. Her father had been protecting himself from her testimony. By the time her father announced her chemistry education, Marjorie's mind was almost entirely clear, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, what her father was doing. He was giving her the tools she would need to destroy him. Dr. Thomas Weatherby arrived at Cypress Grove on the second Tuesday of May 1835, carrying leather cases filled with books and scientific instruments. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, thin and angular, with gray hair pulled back in an old-fashioned queue, and spectacles that he had a habit of adjusting frequently. He had been educated in the North, Harvard College, and then additional study in chemistry at an institute in Boston. He was eccentric in the way that scholars often are, uncomfortable in social situations, more at ease with books and apparatus than with people. William Ellison Jr. had hired him through an intermediary in Charleston. He had not interviewed Dr. Weatherby in person. He had simply read references that confirmed the man's credentials and arranged for payment through the post. This was a mistake, one of several critical errors that William Ellison Jr. would make in the coming months. Dr. Weatherby's first lesson with Marjorie took place in the library, a room on the second floor of Cypress Grove that overlooked the gardens. Marjorie entered the room to find the scholar sitting at a table, surrounded by his apparatus. Glass vessels, copper scales, small bottles containing various compounds, a leather-bound notebook, and a stack of books. "Miss Ellison," Dr. Weatherby said, standing to greet her. "I am Dr. Thomas Weatherby. Your father has arranged for me to provide you with instruction in chemistry. I must say I was somewhat surprised by this arrangement. It is not common in my experience for young women to receive scientific education, but your father has indicated that you possess unusual intellectual capacity. I am inclined to believe him, though I reserve judgment until I have assessed your aptitude myself." "How do you do?" Marjorie said formally. She sat across from him, back straight, hands folded in her lap, the picture of a well-educated young woman. Dr. Weatherby studied her carefully. "Your father also mentioned that you have suffered from a nervous complaint, that you have been medicated for an extended period, that you are recovering but remain somewhat fragile. He asked me to proceed carefully with the material to avoid overtaxing your mind." "My father is concerned about my well-being," Marjorie said carefully. "Is he?" Dr. Weatherby removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a small cloth that he produced from his pocket. When he replaced them, his eyes seemed sharper, more focused. "I have developed over many years of instruction the ability to discern when parents are being truthful about their children's conditions and when they are being, shall we say, economical with the truth. Your father falls into the second category. I would estimate, Miss Ellison, that your condition is not as fragile as he has indicated." Marjorie said nothing. She was learning in this moment that Dr. Weatherby was capable of perceiving things that most people missed. "However," Dr. Weatherby continued, "I am not in the business of calling attention to the discrepancies between what parents say and what I observe. That would be presumptuous. Instead, I will proceed with the chemistry instruction as planned. And if you prove capable of understanding the material, I will assume that your mind is more robust than your father has suggested. Shall we begin?" "Yes, Dr. Weatherby," Marjorie said. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Weatherby provided an introduction to chemistry. He explained the concept of elements, substances that could not be broken down into simpler components. He showed her copper and sulfur and other basic materials. He explained the concept of compounds, substances that were created by combining elements in specific proportions. He showed her how copper could combine with sulfur to create a completely different substance with entirely different properties. "Chemistry," he said as the lesson was concluding, "is the science of transformation. It is the study of how matter can be broken down and recombined. It is the study of the fundamental properties of the material world." This knowledge was once the domain of alchemists, people who believed they could transform base metals into gold. The alchemists were wrong about the gold, but they were correct that matter can be transformed. That is what chemistry teaches us. Everything can be transformed. Everything can be broken down and recombined. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is truly unchangeable. Marjorie absorbed this, understanding, even in that first lesson, that Dr. Weatherby was teaching her something more profound than the mere mechanics of chemistry. He was teaching her that the world was not fixed. He was teaching her that transformation was possible. By the third lesson, Marjorie understood what Dr. Weatherby was actually doing. He was teaching her about poisons, not explicitly, not directly, but the material was structured in such a way that any intelligent person could draw the obvious conclusions. He taught her about arsenic and its properties. He taught her about the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, violent illness, burning sensations in the throat, eventually cessation of heart function. He taught her about mercury and its effects on the human body, tremors, loss of teeth, gradual deterioration of mental function. He taught her about plant-based poisons, foxglove, which could affect heart rate, oleander, which could cause violent illness, hemlock, which could paralyze. For each poison, he taught her the lethal dose, the symptoms, the time interval between administration and onset of symptoms, the time between onset and death. He taught her how to recognize the signs of poisoning in a living body. He taught her how to distinguish between poisoning and natural illness. He taught her how to administer substances without detection, how to combine compounds to create effects that would seem natural, how to use timing to ensure that the poisoning would not be immediately attributable to any single cause. On the fifth lesson, after Dr. Weatherby had concluded his formal instruction for the day and was beginning to pack his instruments, Marjorie asked him directly. "Dr. Weatherby," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "you are teaching me how to poison people. That is the actual purpose of these lessons, is it not? Not to educate me about chemistry, but to teach me the practical application of creating toxins and administering them without detection." Dr. Weatherby paused in the act of closing one of his leather cases. He turned to look at Marjorie, and for a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Yes," he said simply, "that is precisely what I am doing." Marjorie felt something shift inside her chest. Part of her wanted to flee from this confession. Part of her wanted to report this man to her father, to have him removed from the premises immediately. But the larger part of her, the part that had spent 12 years coming to terms with what she had witnessed in that cellar, understood that this was precisely what she needed. "Why?" she asked. Dr. Weatherby set down his case and moved to one of the windows that overlooked the gardens. For a moment he stood in silence, looking out at the landscape of Cypress Grove. "I have been in the business of education for 30 years, he said at last. "I have taught young men in universities. I have taught young women in academies. I have attempted to pass on knowledge to the next generation with the hope that knowledge would be used for good purposes. But I have learned over the course of my career that knowledge is neutral. It is neither good nor evil. It is how knowledge is used that determines its morality." He turned back to face Marjorie. "Your father came to me 6 months ago," he continued. "He told me that he had a daughter who was recovering from a prolonged illness. He said that she had been taking various medications, but that she was now becoming clearer-minded. He said that he wanted to educate her in chemistry so that she would understand the natural world and accept her place within the order of things." "And what did you tell him?" Marjorie asked. "I told him that I would consider it," Dr. Weatherby said. "And then I did something that I rarely do. I made discreet inquiries about William Ellison Jr. and about you, specifically. I learned some interesting things. I learned that you had been heavily medicated for 12 years for a condition that seemed to have no clear medical basis. I learned that before you were medicated, you had been considered an unusually intelligent and observant child. I learned that you had allegedly attempted violence against your father on one occasion, though no one seemed to be clear about the circumstances. He adjusted his spectacles. I concluded that your father was not actually asking me to educate you, he said. He was asking me to educate you in a way that would control your thinking, to provide you with knowledge that would support his worldview, knowledge that would convince you that strength was more important than morality, that power justified any act, that this was simply the nature of things. He wanted me to be an instrument of indoctrination, not education. And instead, Marjorie asked, Dr. Weatherby said, I decided to teach you actual chemistry, because I am old, Miss Ellison, and I have made many compromises in my life, and I am tired of compromising. Because it amuses me to imagine your father's face if he realized what I was actually teaching you. And because I suspect that you might be the kind of person who would use this knowledge not for power over others, but for justice, though I could be wrong about that. People often surprise me in unpleasant ways. He began packing his materials again with careful deliberation. Your father will not notice what I am actually teaching you, he continued, because your father is not paying careful attention. He believes that intelligence is something that can be controlled through education, that if he guides your learning carefully enough, he can direct your conclusions. This is the fallacy of mediocre minds. They do not understand that once you give someone the tools to think, you cannot control what they think. He closed his cases and looked at Marjorie one final time. Your father is a participant in something, he said quietly. Something that takes place in the cellar of this house. Something that involves other men. Specific rituals and practices that would be considered abominable if they were ever made public. He has convinced you that you are mad to try to prevent you from speaking about what you have witnessed. He has medicated you for 12 years for the crime of being observant. If you had asked me, before today, what I thought the chances were that you would ever discover the truth, I would have said they were minimal. But now I am less certain, and I believe in giving people the information they need to make their own choices, even if those choices are terrible. He picked up his cases. I will continue to come here twice weekly, he said. I will continue to provide instruction in chemistry, and I will continue to teach you things that your father does not realize I am teaching you. What you do with that knowledge is entirely your concern, but I would suggest, Miss Ellison, that you take some time to reflect on what you want your life to become, because if you are going to use this knowledge, and I suspect you are, then you should understand that there are consequences. There are always consequences. With that, Dr. Weatherby gathered his belongings and left the library, leaving Marjorie alone with the implications of what he had said and the beginnings of a plan that would consume the next months of her life. After Dr. Weatherby's departure, Marjorie spent the evening and most of the night lying in her bed staring at the ceiling and allowing the memories that she had spent 12 years trying to suppress come flooding back. She remembered the heat of that summer evening when she was 12. The search for her cat, the discovery of the open cellar door, the descent into darkness. She remembered the chanting, the rhythmic sound of 13 voices speaking in unison, speaking words in a language she did not understand. She remembered the light from the candles, the sight of her father, his face serious and focused, dressed in robes marked with symbols that seemed to represent something ancient and terrible. She remembered the woman on the altar, the terror in her eyes, the convulsion of her body as the knife came down. She remembered her father's voice, perfectly calm, speaking to the other men about what they had just done, using words like necessity and fertility and power. She remembered being led back through the cellar, her father's hand on her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave bruises. She remembered her father telling her that she was mad, that she had imagined everything, that her mind could not be trusted. She remembered the medications, the fog that had slowly descended over her thinking, blurring the edges of her memories, making her doubt what she had witnessed. She remembered with perfect clarity that everything her father had told her about her own mental state had been a lie. The next morning, Marjorie did something that she had not done in 12 years. She got out of bed early before anyone else in the house was awake, and she went to the cellar. The main chamber was exactly as it always was. Storage areas, shelves holding preserved foods and wine, darkness in the corners. But Marjorie was not interested in the main chamber. She was interested in what lay beyond. It took her nearly an hour to find the hidden panel. She had been only 12 years old the last time she had been in this cellar, and her memory of the exact location was imperfect. But she remembered that it was in the back wall, somewhere near a stack of wine barrels. She began running her hands along the bricks, pressing gently, looking for anything that felt loose or different. Finally, she found it, a section of the wall that, when pressed in a particular spot, gave way and revealed the mechanism of a hidden panel. She manipulated it carefully, and with a soft grinding sound, the panel slid open. Beyond the panel was the chamber that had haunted her nightmares for 12 years. It was smaller than she remembered, the way that childhood places often are when you encounter them as an adult. But it was otherwise exactly as she remembered it. The altar, stained with something dark that might have been blood or might have been rust or might have been something else entirely. The shelves lining the walls, the robes, the masks, the books, and the ledger. Marjorie's hands were shaking as she approached the shelves. She reached for the large volume bound in red leather. It was locked, but the lock was not particularly sophisticated. She found a small iron implement on one of the shelves and used it to manipulate the mechanism until the lock gave way. When she opened the ledger, she found herself reading her father's confession. The entries were dated beginning in 1822, the year her father had been initiated into the Brethren. Each entry documented a gathering, including the date, the time, and the names of the men who had attended. The entries also documented the purpose of each gathering, the specific rituals that had been performed, and the outcomes. The language in the entries was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. It was the language of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was simply part of the natural order of things. It was the language of someone who had severed whatever moral connections he might once have had between his actions and their consequences. Marjorie read about rituals designed to increase fertility, rituals that apparently required the presence of enslaved women and the participation of Brethren members in sexual acts. She read about rituals designed to increase prosperity, rituals that apparently required violence and, in some cases, death. She read about specific people, enslaved people from Cypress Grove and from other plantations, who had been brought to the cellar, who had participated in or been the subjects of these rituals, and who had not left alive. She read about a woman named Grace, who had been brought to the cellar in the summer of 1823, the summer when Marjorie was 12 years old. The entry describing what had happened to Grace was the one that matched Marjorie's own memories. The altar, the knife, the ritual performed in front of the assembled brethren. According to her father's ledger, Grace had been a particularly important sacrifice because her death had been accompanied by specific rituals designed to ensure a bountiful rice harvest that year. Marjorie closed the ledger and sat down on the floor of the hidden chamber, her entire body shaking. She had been right. She had not been mad. She had not imagined any of it. For 12 years, her father had told her that her own mind could not be trusted, and for 12 years she had believed him. But the ledger confirmed that everything she remembered had been real. She stayed in the hidden chamber for nearly an hour. She read through the entire ledger, documenting each ritual, each participant, each victim. By the time she closed the volume for the final time, she had understood several things with absolute clarity. First, that her father was a murderer, and had been for the past 13 years. Second, that he had systematically destroyed her mind with medications in order to prevent her from speaking about what she had witnessed. Third, that the medications were poisoning her, slowly but deliberately, destroying her capacity for clear thinking, disrupting her memory, making her doubt her own perceptions. Fourth, that Dr. Weatherby had been sent by her father with the intention of controlling her thinking, and that Dr. Weatherby instead had chosen to give her the tools she would need to fight back. And fifth, that if she did not act, if she did not do something to stop her father and the men of the Brethren, then nothing would stop them. They would continue to do what they were doing, would continue to kill, would continue to operate with complete impunity, protected by their wealth and their status and their absolute certainty that what they were doing was justified. She replaced the ledger on the shelf and carefully manipulated the panel until it closed behind her. As she climbed the cellar stairs and returned to the main house, she was aware that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The fog that had surrounded her thinking for 12 years was lifting. The doubt that had been instilled in her was being replaced by absolute conviction. She understood by the time she reached her room that she was going to poison every single member of the Brethren of the Harvest. She did not yet know how she would accomplish this. She did not yet understand all of the implications of what she was planning. But she understood that this was what she was going to do, and that understanding filled her with a sense of purpose that had been absent from her life since she was 12 years old. Over the next month, Marjorie transformed herself. She continued to take her father's prescribed medications, but she only pretended to drink them. She hid the laudanum beneath her mattress. She wrapped the mercury compounds in cloth and buried them in the garden, in a location that she marked with a small stone. She endured the physical symptoms of withdrawal, the sweating at night, the tremors in her hands, the moments when her anxiety was so intense that she could barely leave her room. But she pushed through it all, because she understood that she needed to be clear-minded for what was coming. She needed her mind to be sharp, her thinking to be precise, her judgment to be sound. As her mind cleared, she became aware of things that she had not been aware of for 12 years. She became aware of the servants in the house, their names, their histories, their relationships to each other. She became aware of the work that each servant did, the routine of the household, the times when various servants would be in various places. She became aware of the routes that food took from the kitchen to the dining room, the ways in which meals were prepared and served. She became, in other words, aware of the vulnerabilities in the household structure. She understood by the time she had been free of medications for 6 weeks exactly how she would poison her father and the men of the Brethren. It was simple, really. The most obvious method was always the best method. The poison would enter the household through the kitchen. The poison would be administered through the servants who prepared the food. The poison would be invisible, would be undetectable, would seem to be nothing more than natural illness. She needed an ally, someone in the kitchen who had reason to hate the men of the Brethren, someone who could be trusted not to betray her, someone who understood that what she was planning was not merely murder, but justice. She found this ally in Rose. Rose had been at Cypress Grove for 15 years. She had been bought as a young woman, brought from a plantation in Georgia where she had been born and where she had spent the first 15 years of her life. At Cypress Grove, Rose had given birth to a son. The boy had been born in 1823, the same year that Marjorie had witnessed the ritual in the cellar. Rose's son, whose name was David, had been raised in the quarters with the other children, had been a bright boy with an unusual capacity for learning, had been marked early on as someone with potential. In 1828, when David was 5 years old, Marjorie's father had made a choice that would destroy Rose's life. He had decided to sell David. According to the ledger that Marjorie had read, this had been done deliberately to demonstrate to a member of the Brethren the absolute power that the organization possessed. William Ellison Jr. had separated a mother from a 5-year-old child to prove a point. He had sold the boy to a plantation owner in Alabama, a man known for the brutality of his management, a man whose plantations had some of the highest mortality rates in the South. Rose had never seen her son again. She did not know whether he was still alive. She did not know whether he was still in Alabama or had been sold again to another plantation. She knew only that her son was gone, that she had been separated from him deliberately and cruelly, that her father had done this thing without hesitation or doubt. Marjorie approached Rose one afternoon in the kitchen when the other servants had been sent to the fields and they were alone. She came directly to the point. "Rose," she said, "my father sold your son to punishment and death. I have proof of this. I have documentation of what he did and why he did it. I am going to poison my father and the men who participated in his decisions. I am going to do this through the food that you prepare. I need to know if you are willing to help me." Rose was silent for a very long time. She was standing at a wooden table where she had been preparing vegetables for dinner. Her hands, work-worn and scarred, stilled at Marjorie's words. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "Tell me what you need," Rose said. Night. The summer of 1835 arrived with the kind of heat that made the low country itself seem to transform into something alien and hostile. The air was thick, almost liquid in its weight, and the humidity was suffocating. The rice fields steamed in the mornings when the dew evaporated and the dark water moved sluggishly as if the marshes themselves were reluctant to support life. It was in this oppressive season that Marjorie and Rose began their work. The first target was Judge Pelham. He was a man of 63 years, one of the original members of the Brethren, one of the men whose name appeared most frequently in her father's ledger in connection with the most horrific acts. Judge Pelham had participated in at least 7 rituals that had resulted in death. He had used his position as a judge to ensure that any investigation into the Brethren's activities would be deflected or dismissed. He had, according to the ledger, even arranged for the legal proceedings to be halted when questions were asked about the disappearance of enslaved people from various plantations. Judge Pelham was expected to dine at Cypress Grove on the first Wednesday of June. It would be a small gathering, only 5 men, all of them members of the Brethren. They would gather in the evening after the enslaved people had been locked into their quarters, after any servants who were not part of the household's most intimate circle had been dismissed. They would eat a meal prepared in the house kitchen, and during that meal, Judge Pelham would ingest the first dose of poison that Marjorie had prepared. Working late into the night in the kitchen, with Rose standing guard to ensure that they were not interrupted, Marjorie had ground foxglove leaves into a powder so fine that it was almost invisible. She had mixed this powder into a compound that she had created by combining arsenic with crushed herbs designed to mask the taste. The result was a substance that, when added to food in small quantities, would be completely undetectable to the palate. The poison worked on the heart. It would take several days for the symptoms to manifest, but once they did, Judge Pelham would begin to experience chest pain and irregular heartbeat. He would develop a fever. His body would become confused, misinterpreting the signals that his own heart was sending. Over the course of 2 weeks, if the poison was administered carefully in multiple doses spread over time, the heart would gradually become more and more disrupted until, finally, it would simply stop. "How will you administer it?" Rose asked, watching as Marjorie carefully measured out portions of the compound. "In his dessert," Marjorie said, "the cake that you will prepare. You will have him served a special cake, made according to his own preferences. He will eat it completely, thinking nothing of it. And over the next days, as the poison moves through his body, he will begin to sicken. By the time he understands that he has been poisoned, it will be too late." "And when he dies," Rose asked, "what story will we tell?" "The truth," Marjorie said. "We will tell people that he became ill suddenly, as people sometimes do in the Low Country. We will tell them that a physician was called, but that nothing could be done. We will tell them that he died of heart failure brought on by fever sickness. Everyone will believe us because people die all the time for no reason that can be adequately explained. Our story will be so ordinary, so expected, that no one will question it." On the evening of June 3rd, Judge Pelham arrived at Cypress Grove with his wife and 2 other Brethren members. They gathered in the dining room, and Rose served them the meal that she and Marjorie had prepared. The first course was soup, the second course was fish, the third course was meat and vegetables, and for dessert there was the special cake. Judge Pelham took a large slice. His wife declined dessert, citing concerns about her figure. The other 2 men each had a modest portion. Marjorie, watching from her position near the kitchen door, saw Judge Pelham consume nearly the entire cake himself. "Good," she whispered to Rose. "He has taken enough. Now we wait." The waiting was harder than Marjorie had anticipated. For 3 days, nothing happened. Judge Pelham went about his normal business. He attended to his duties as a judge. He met with other members of the Brethren. He showed no signs of illness whatsoever. On the 4th day, things began to change. Judge Pelham reported feeling chest pain. It was mild at first, he told his wife, nothing to be concerned about. Perhaps he had overindulged at dinner. Perhaps it was indigestion, but by that evening the pain had intensified. By the next morning he had developed a fever. A physician was called, a man named Dr. Gerald Harmon. Dr. Harmon examined Judge Pelham and found his heart to be somewhat irregular. He recommended bloodletting, the standard cure for most ailments in 1835. He prescribed various medications, including mercury-based compounds similar to the ones that had been used to medicate Marjorie. None of these interventions had any effect on the poison that was moving through Judge Pelham's system. By the 10th day of his illness, Judge Pelham was in considerable agony. His heart was beating irregularly, sometimes racing, sometimes seeming to stop altogether. He was delirious with fever. He called out for his mother. He begged for relief. On the 15th day, his heart simply stopped and Judge Pelham died. The cause of death was listed as fever brought on by an unknown illness. The death was attributed to the diseases that regularly swept through the Low Country, claiming victims without regard to age or status or wealth. Judge Pelham's funeral was attended by a large number of people. The other members of the Brethren mourned him, though no one seemed to suspect foul play. And Marjorie knew that she had successfully crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had killed a man. She had poisoned him deliberately, methodically, and with complete success. The act that had seemed theoretical when she was reading the ledger, the act that she had planned in abstract detail with Rose, had now become real. She had not expected it to feel this way. She had thought that killing one of the men who had participated in the murder of Grace, one of the men who had been part of her father's cruelty, would feel justified, righteous, clean. Instead, it felt heavy. It felt dark. It felt like something inside her had died along with Judge Pelham. But she could not dwell on these feelings. There were still 12 more members of the Brethren to kill, and her father. By the end of June, 2 more men were dead. Reverend Crenshaw, who had been instrumental in providing spiritual justification for the Brethren's activities, died of what appeared to be cholera. He experienced violent illness, became delirious, and died within 10 days. A plantation owner named Charles Weatherman, who had been one of the wealthiest members of the organization, died of fever after a brief illness. Both deaths were attributed to the diseases of the season, but not everyone accepted these explanations without question. In the Brethren's meetings, gatherings that continued to occur in the hidden cellar where Marjorie's father insisted that business must continue as usual, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. 3 men had died in less than a month. 3 men who had been in perfect health just weeks before. 3 men who had no obvious cause of death. "It is cholera," one of the remaining members insisted, a man named Thomas Simmons, a wealthy plantation owner from Charleston. "We have seen this before. In the hot months, cholera moves through the region. It claims whoever it wishes, regardless of status or precaution. There is no mystery here." But another man, a merchant named Richard Blackwood, was less convinced. "3 members of the Brethren," he said. 3 deaths in less than a month. How many other families in the region have lost 3 members so quickly? I do not believe this is coincidence. "What else would it be?" William Ellison Jr. asked. His voice was calm, but Marjorie, listening from outside the cellar door where she had positioned herself to observe the meeting, detected an undercurrent of strain. "What other explanation would you suggest?" "I would suggest," Blackwood said slowly, "that someone is poisoning us." The suggestion hung in the air, like a foul odor. The other men shifted uncomfortably. The idea was so absurd, so far outside the realm of reasonable possibility, that it took a moment for anyone to fully process what Blackwood had said. "Poisoning us?" Thomas Simmons laughed nervously. "By whom? We are the most powerful men in this region. Who would have either the audacity or the access to poison us?" "That is a good question," Blackwood said. "But I would suggest that we consider the possibility. I would suggest that we at least acknowledge that 3 deaths in 4 weeks is unusual. I would suggest that we be careful about what we eat and drink. I would suggest that someone should investigate." William Ellison Jr. stood up from his chair at the altar's head. His face was still calm, but his hands were clenched into fists. "We are not going to investigate," he said flatly. "We are not going to discuss this outside of this room. We are not going to suggest to anyone that we believe we are being targeted. To do so would raise questions about who we are and what we do, and I will not allow that. We will treat these deaths as unfortunate incidents brought on by the diseases of the season. We will attend the funerals, we will express our condolences, we will continue with our work as though nothing has changed. Is that understood?" The other men exchanged glances, but no one voiced further objection. They understood that William Ellison Jr. was not someone to be contradicted, not someone whose authority could be questioned, and they understood that if they raised this issue publicly, if they suggested that they had been deliberately poisoned, they would be inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny that would expose everything. So they said nothing. They agreed to follow William Ellison Jr.'s directive, and they continued to gather, continued to participate in rituals, continued to live their lives as though nothing was happening. But the paranoia had been introduced. The idea that something was hunting them, that someone was targeting them for destruction, had taken root in their minds. And as more men began to die, that paranoia would only intensify. You, by the middle of July, the fourth death occurred. A man named Marcus Fanning, who had been one of the original members of the Brethren, died after a short illness that manifested as violent stomach pain, followed by delirium and death. His wife reported that he had seemed perfectly healthy at breakfast, but that by evening he had become violently ill. A physician was called, but there was nothing that could be done. The fifth death came 3 days later. This time it was someone who was not a member of the Brethren's inner circle, but someone who had been associated with them. A man named Jonathan Fields, who ran a plantation in the neighboring county and who had occasionally attended Brethren gatherings as a guest. He died of what appeared to be the same illness that had killed Marcus Fanning, violent sickness followed by delirium and death. And then on July 18th, something unexpected happened. William Ellison Jr. called Marjorie into his study. She came, trying to appear calm, trying to conceal the fear that was rising in her throat. Had he discovered something? Had he realized what she was doing? Was this the moment when everything unraveled? But when she entered the study, she found her father sitting behind his desk, and his expression was not one of suspicion. It was one of something else, something that looked almost like resignation. "Marjorie," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "I need to speak with you about something that has been troubling me." Marjorie sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral. "People are dying," her father said. "Members of the Brethren are dying. 5 men in 6 weeks. 5 men who had no reason to die, who showed no signs of illness until suddenly they were seized by violent sickness. And I have begun to wonder if perhaps your chemistry lessons are not quite what they appear to be." Marjorie's heart began to race. She forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "I do not understand, Father," she said. "What do my chemistry lessons have to do with the deaths of your associates?" William Ellison Jr. leaned back in his chair. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "I have been thinking about what Dr. Weatherby has been teaching you," he said. "I have been thinking about the fact that I hired him to teach you chemistry, and that shortly thereafter, members of the Brethren began to die in ways that suggested they had been poisoned. And I have been wondering if perhaps you have decided to use your new knowledge for purposes that I did not intend." "Why would I do such a thing?" Marjorie asked. Her voice was steady, but inside she was calculating. Had he truly figured it out? Or was this a test? "Because," her father said, "you are intelligent. Because you remember things that I thought I had made you forget. Because you hate me, and you hate the men who have done terrible things. Because you believe that justice requires action, that the law will not provide. Because you are your father's daughter, and you understand the power of planning and execution." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds of Cypress Grove. "If you are poisoning members of the Brethren," he said without turning around, "I want you to know that I understand why. I want you to know that I am aware of what these men have done. I want you to know that I am not innocent in these matters. I am one of them. I have participated in the rituals. I have sanctioned the violence. I have used the philosophy of the Brethren to justify acts that should never be justified." He turned back to face his daughter. "But I am also your father," he said, "and I am asking you to stop. Stop the poisoning. Stop this revenge. Let the matter rest. Let these men live their lives, and let us all move forward." Marjorie felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not what she had expected. She had expected denial, or anger, or perhaps an attempt to have her arrested. She had not expected her father to acknowledge what she was doing and to ask her, as a father, to stop. "If I stop," she said carefully, "what happens to the information I have gathered? What happens to the ledger? What happens to the knowledge of what the Brethren has done?" William Ellison Jr. was silent for a long moment. "That," he said finally, "is a choice that you will have to make. But I am asking you as your father to choose mercy, to choose forgiveness, to choose to move beyond this." "Mercy!" Marjorie felt a sudden surge of anger. "Mercy! You poisoned me for 12 years to protect your secrets. You destroyed my mind. You made me doubt my own memories. You destroyed my life, and now you are asking me for mercy? Yes, her father said simply. That is exactly what I'm asking. Marjorie stood up. She looked at her father for a long moment, and then she spoke words that she knew would change everything. No, she said, I will not show mercy, not to you and not to the men who have participated in your cruelty. You have all made choices. You have all decided that the suffering of others was acceptable in pursuit of your own power. And now you must face the consequences of those choices. She walked toward the door. How many more? Her father asked quietly. Marjorie paused at the threshold. Without turning around, she answered his question. All of them, she said, every member of the Brethren, and then you. By the end of July, the 6th and 7th members of the Brethren were dead. Thomas Simmons, who had advocated for an investigation into the poisonings, died after a brief illness marked by violent fever and delirium. A man named Edward Gaines, who owned a large plantation in Alabama and who had been involved in some of the Brethren's most brutal activities, died in similar circumstances while visiting Cypress Grove. The panic among the surviving members of the Brethren was now impossible to hide. 8 men had died in less than 2 months. The organization that had functioned in secret for 13 years, the organization that had believed itself to be untouchable, was being systematically dismantled. An emergency meeting was called for August 1st. All surviving members of the Brethren, 6 men now down from 13, gathered in the hidden cellar at midnight. Marjorie, positioned outside the cellar door where she could hear the conversation, listened as the men discussed their mounting terror. Someone is killing us, Richard Blackwood said bluntly. Someone is deliberately poisoning members of this organization. I do not know who, and I do not know how, but I know what is happening, and I believe we should disperse. I believe we should abandon this organization immediately and flee to other regions where we can rebuild. We cannot flee, another man said. His name was Peter Drummond, and he was a physician. If we flee, we draw attention. If we draw attention, everything comes out. Our histories, our activities, everything will be exposed. But if we stay, we die, Blackwood shot back. I prefer exposure to death. And what would you be exposing? Drummond asked. Your participation in murder, your involvement in rituals designed to harm innocent people, your betrayal of the trust that your communities have placed in you? Yes, fleeing would expose us to suspicion. But staying here means death. We must choose between exposure and extinction. The argument raged on. Some men argued for immediate dispersal. Others argued for investigation. Still others argued for attempting to identify the person who was poisoning them and eliminating that threat before moving forward. In the end, it was William Ellison Jr. who made the decision. He stood at the altar's head, and he quieted the chaos with a single gesture. We will not flee, he said. To flee is to admit guilt, and I will not admit guilt. We will continue as though nothing has changed. We will be careful about what we eat and drink. We will increase security around our homes and our families, and we will attempt to identify who is responsible for these deaths. And how do you propose we do that? One of the men asked. By examining who has access to us, William Ellison Jr. said. By examining who could have the knowledge and the opportunity to poison us. By examining who would have reason to wish us dead. Marjorie felt her breath catch in her throat. He knew. She was certain now that he knew. But he was not going to accuse her directly. He was not going to expose her or attempt to have her arrested. He was simply going to allow the conversation to continue, to allow the other men to draw their own conclusions. And slowly, as the meeting continued, it became clear that none of them would suspect his daughter. The idea that a woman, a sheltered, educated woman, could be systematically murdering them was simply too far outside the realm of possibility that they could conceive of it. Instead, they developed other theories. Perhaps it was a rival plantation owner attempting to destabilize their organization. Perhaps it was an enslaved person seeking revenge for brutal treatment. Perhaps it was a natural phenomenon, some disease or plague that was specifically targeting members of their group. None of them arrived at the truth, and by the time the meeting ended, 3 more men had volunteered to increase security around their homes, to be more careful about what they ate, to watch for suspicious activity. But none of it would matter, because Marjorie and Rose had already prepared the poison that would kill 2 more men in August. and they had already begun planning for the final members of the Brethren. By August 15th, 9 members of the Brethren of the Harvest were dead. Only 4 remained. And Marjorie, sitting in her room at Cypress Grove, looking at the notebook where she had been documenting each death, understood that she had passed the point of no return. She had become a murderer. She had killed 9 men. She was planning to kill 4 more. And when she was finished with the Brethren, she was planning to kill her own father. The knowledge of what she had become sat heavy in her chest. There had been a moment when Judge Pelham died, when she had believed that the act would feel righteous. She had believed that justice would feel clean, would feel pure, but it had not. Each death had added weight to her soul, had drawn her further into darkness, had transformed her into the very thing that she hated. She was no longer certain whether what she was doing was justice or whether it was simply revenge dressed up in the language of rightness. She was no longer certain whether killing 9 men had moved her toward some larger good or whether it had simply made the world darker. But the momentum of what she had set in motion was too great to stop. The Brethren was fragmenting. Fear was eating away at the surviving members from the inside. And the only way to end this, to bring closure, was to complete what she had started. She sat down and wrote a letter to her father. "Father," she wrote, "I know that you know what I have done. I know that you have suspected for some time that I have been poisoning the members of the Brethren. I am writing to confirm that this is true. I have killed 9 men. I am planning to kill 4 more. And then I am planning to kill you. I am not doing this because I hate you, though I do. I am doing this because the Brethren represents something that must be destroyed. It represents the belief that power justifies cruelty. It represents the idea that some people are meant to dominate and consume others. It represents the conviction that ritual and philosophy can transform murder into necessity. I am giving you a choice, Father. You can take your own life, and I will not pursue you further. You can choose the manner of your death instead of allowing me to choose it for you. You can end this with some measure of dignity remaining, or you can continue as you have been, and I will ensure that your death is not merely the end of your life, but the complete obliteration of everything you have built. You have 72 hours to decide. After that time, the next dose of poison will be administered, and you will begin to experience the symptoms that have claimed the other members of the Brethren. You will suffer. You will beg for relief, and you will die knowing that your own daughter orchestrated your destruction. The choice is yours. Your daughter, Marjorie." She sealed the letter and instructed Rose to deliver it to her father's study. Then she went to her room and waited for his response. Her father did not respond for 3 days. Then, on August 18th, he summoned her to his study once more. When Marjorie entered, she found her father sitting behind his desk, but this time he was not calm. He was visibly agitated. There were shadows under his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured for her to sit. "Your letter," he said without preamble. "Your letter is a confession of murder. Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand that I could take this letter to the authorities and have you arrested, tried, and hanged?" "Yes," Marjorie said. "I understand that. But you will not do it, because if you do, then the truth about the Brethren comes out. The truth about what you have done. The truth about the murders that you and your associates have committed. If you attempt to have me arrested, you ensure your own destruction." Her father stood up and began to pace back and forth across his study. His movements were agitated, almost frantic. "What do you want?" he demanded. "What would cause you to stop this madness?" "I want you to confess," Marjorie said. "I want you to turn yourself and all the surviving members of the Brethren over to the authorities. I want the truth to come out. I want justice through the legal system, not through my own hands." "That is impossible," her father said. "If I confess, I will hang. The men who survive will hang. Everything will be destroyed. Our families, our reputations, our legacies. There must be another way." "There is," Marjorie said. "You can die now, while I can still pretend that it was natural illness. Or you can die later, after the truth comes out, and die knowing that you destroyed everything yourself." Her father stopped pacing. He looked at his daughter with something that might have been love or might have been despair. "I am going to give you one final opportunity," he said. "I am going to offer you money. I am going to offer you the means to leave South Carolina. I am going to offer you a new life, somewhere far from here, far from the brethren, far from everything that has happened at Cypress Grove. Take it. Take the money and go. Let this end. Let me continue my life and you continue yours, and we both pretend that this nightmare never happened." For a moment, Marjorie was tempted. The prospect of escape, of leaving all of this behind, of starting fresh somewhere else, it was seductive. She could take the money and go north. She could build a new life. She could try to forget. But she understood that forgetting was not possible. She understood that if she left, her father and the surviving members of the Brethren would continue to operate. They would continue to hurt people. They would continue to justify their cruelty with philosophy and ritual. They would continue to poison the world with their presence. "No," she said, "I will not accept your offer. The Brethren must be destroyed. All of you must face consequences. That is the only way this ends." The night after her confrontation with her father, Marjorie found something on her pillow, a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. Beside it was a note in her father's handwriting. "I cannot do what you are asking," the note read. "I cannot turn myself over to authorities. I cannot face that kind of public humiliation, that kind of judgment. But I also cannot continue this life, knowing what I have done, knowing what I will continue to do if I am given the chance to live. I am therefore offering you a gift. Take this, administer it. Let me choose the manner of my death, and know that in doing so, I am acknowledging your power. You have won, Marjorie. You have defeated me. Allow me the dignity of choosing my own ending." Marjorie held the vial in her hand for a very long time. She understood what this was. This was her father's surrender. This was his admission that she had been right all along, that the Brethren was a darkness that should not be allowed to exist, that the system he had built on cruelty and power was fundamentally corrupt. But she also understood that this was not her victory. This was merely postponement of what had to happen. Because even if her father took his own life, there were still 4 members of the Brethren alive. There was still the structure of evil that they represented. There was still the knowledge of what they had done. There was still the necessity of ensuring that they faced consequences. She set the vial aside. She did not throw it away. She did not destroy it. She simply left it on her nightstand, as though it were an ordinary thing, an ordinary choice, an ordinary decision waiting to be made. The next morning she met with Rose in the kitchen. "The remaining members," Marjorie said. "How many do you know the locations of?" "3, Rose said. "Richard Blackwood is staying at a plantation in the neighboring county. Peter Drummond is in Charleston. There is a 4th man, but I do not know where he is. His name is Jonas Hendricks, and he has already fled the region." "Then we focus on the 3 we can reach," Marjorie said. "Blackwood first. Can you send word to the cook at his plantation? Can you arrange for someone we can trust to administer the poison?" "I can try," Rose said. "My cousin works at that plantation. I can send a message. But Marjorie, you understand what will happen if we continue? You understand that at some point people will begin to notice the pattern? People will begin to ask questions. The authorities will become involved?" "I understand," Marjorie said. "That is why we must work quickly. That is why the remaining deaths must occur within days of each other, not weeks. If they all die suddenly, all within the same brief window, people will attribute it to a plague or a disease sweeping through the region. They will not suspect deliberate poisoning." Rose nodded slowly. She had become complicit in murder, and she understood that there was no going back from this. The only way forward was through. Lasso. Within the week, the 8th member of the Brethren was dead. Richard Blackwood died at the plantation where he was staying, experiencing the same symptoms that had killed the others: violent illness, fever, delirium, and finally, death. His family called in physicians, but there was nothing that could be done. The death was particularly significant because it meant that the Brethren was now divided geographically. The surviving members were scattered across South Carolina and Georgia. They were no longer gathering in groups. They were no longer coordinating. The organization that had functioned as a cohesive unit for 13 years was now fragmenting into isolated individuals, each one aware that someone was hunting them, each one terrified and paranoid. The 9th death came 3 days later. Peter Drummond, the physician, died in Charleston. He had become ill suddenly while attending to patients at a hospital. He had dismissed the early symptoms as minor, nothing to be concerned about. By evening, he was violently ill. By the next morning, he was dead. This death was particularly satisfying to Marjorie, though she felt shame at the satisfaction. Peter Drummond had been one of the men who had provided medical justification for the Brethren's activities. He had used his position as a physician to conceal evidence of their brutality. He had certified deaths as natural when they were, in fact, orchestrated. His death seemed almost poetic in its irony. By the end of August, only 3 members of the Brethren remained alive: William Ellison Jr. and 2 others, men who were not involved in the most brutal activities, men who had been inducted later into the organization, men who had participated but who had not taken leading roles in the rituals. Marjorie arranged for both of them to be poisoned within days of each other. One man died in his home in the neighboring county, his death attributed to a sudden fever. The other man died during a journey back to his plantation in Georgia, collapsing on the road and expiring within hours. By September 1st, only William Ellison Jr. remained. The organization that had been founded 13 years earlier, the organization that had believed itself to be untouchable, had been entirely dismantled. Every member was dead except for Marjorie's father. William Ellison Jr. knew what was coming. He had been waiting for it all through the deaths of the others. He had watched his associates fall one by one. He had understood that he was next, and he had spent the weeks of September preparing himself for the inevitability of his own death. On September 10th, he called Marjorie into his study one final time. "It is time," he said simply. When she entered, he was sitting at his desk, and in front of him was the vial of poison that he had given her weeks before. "I am ready. I want this to end." Marjorie looked at the vial. She looked at her father. She had imagined this moment for months. She had planned for it. She had expected to feel triumph or satisfaction or closure when it finally arrived. Instead, she felt only sadness and exhaustion. "There's something you need to know," William Ellison Jr. said. "There is something that I should have told you years ago, but I was too much of a coward. When your mother died, I made a choice. I decided that I would use my life to accumulate power. I decided that other people, including you, were simply tools or obstacles in pursuit of that goal. I decided that the philosophy of the Brethren was correct, that the strong were meant to consume the weak." He paused, collecting himself. "But watching you grow up," he continued, "watching you recover from what I did to your mind, watching you transform what was done to you into something purposeful, I began to understand that I was wrong. I began to understand that power purchased through cruelty is not real power. It is the illusion of power. And I began to understand that the only real power is the power to choose to be better than the circumstances into which you have been born." "Why are you telling me this?" Marjorie asked. "Because I want you to understand that what I am about to do is not merely surrender," her father said. "It is acknowledgement. It is admission that you were right and I was wrong. It is my final act of choosing to be something other than what I had become." He picked up the vial. "I am going to drink this," he said, "and when I do, the Brethren will be finished. The organization will cease to exist. The men who participated in its rituals will be gone, and you will be free to decide who you want to be next." "And what of the truth?" Marjorie asked. "What of the ledger? What of the evidence of what you have done?" "That is your decision," her father said. "You can destroy it and let the truth die with me, or you can use it and expose what we have done. But I would ask you to consider this. If you expose the truth, you expose yourself as a murderer. You expose your complicity. You ensure that you will be hunted down and prosecuted, perhaps hanged. Is that justice? Is that something worth sacrificing your own life for?" Marjorie realized in that moment that her father had given her a gift more profound than she had anticipated. He had given her the choice to end this or to continue it into a territory where she would lose everything. "I will destroy the ledger," she said. "I will destroy all evidence of what has happened here, and I will leave South Carolina. I will disappear into the North, and I will attempt to build a life that is not defined by what has happened at Cypress Grove." Her father nodded slowly. "That is a wise choice," he said. "That is the choice of someone who has learned something from all of this. I hope you will find peace, Marjorie. I hope you will find a way to forgive yourself for what you have had to do. He raised the vial to his lips. "Do not watch," he said. "I do not want you to see this. Go to your room. Go anywhere but here. But know that when you return, this will be finished." Marjorie turned and left the study. As she was closing the door behind her, she heard the sound of liquid being drunk. She did not turn around. She did not look back. She simply left, and she went to her room, and she sat on her bed and listened to the silence of the house around her. That night, Marjorie went to the cellar with Rose. They worked together to remove the ledger and all the associated materials from the hidden chamber. They carried the books and the robes and the masks out into the darkness. They poured oil across all of it. And then they struck a match and watched as everything began to burn. The fire was intense, consuming everything it touched, reducing years of documentation and evidence into ash and smoke. Marjorie watched as the red leather ledger, her father's confession, his justification, his eternal damnation, burned until it was nothing but charred remains, unreadable beyond any possibility of recovery. When the fire had burned down to embers, she and Rose scattered the ashes across the grounds of Cypress Grove. They used water to extinguish the remaining flames. They worked until there was no evidence that a fire had ever occurred, until there was nothing left of the brethren except memory. By dawn, it was finished. The organization that had existed for 13 years, the organization that had murdered innocent people, the organization that had been built on a philosophy of power and cruelty, had been entirely erased. There was no evidence. There were no documents. There was no proof that it had ever existed except in the minds of the people who had been part of it. William Ellison Jr. died on September 11th. His death was attributed to a sudden illness brought on by fever. A physician was called, but there was nothing that could be done. He was buried in the family cemetery at Cypress Grove, and his funeral was attended by a reasonable number of people. Not the massive turnout that a truly prominent man would have received, but enough to indicate that he had been someone of substance. Marjorie wore black to the funeral. She spoke to relatives and friends. She accepted their condolences and their expressions of sympathy for her loss. She played the role of a grieving daughter perfectly. No one suspected anything. No one questioned the circumstances of his death. Within a month, Marjorie had made arrangements to leave South Carolina. She had secured travel documents and false identification. She had gathered money, some from her father's estate, some from the household accounts. She had written letters to be delivered after her departure, explaining that she was leaving to recover from her grief in the North. Rose also left. She traveled to a plantation in North Carolina where she attempted to begin a new life, carrying the burden of what she had done, carrying the knowledge that she would never see her son again, carrying the weight of 9 murders that she had helped orchestrate. Before she left, Rose gave Marjorie something. It was a small carved figure, a doll made of wood, decorated with cloth and string. It was crudely made, but it was precious. It was a representation of her son, David, a way of keeping him with her. "I want you to have this," Rose said. "I want you to remember when you are in your new life in the North, what we did and why we did it. I want you to remember that sometimes justice requires becoming something you never thought you would be." Marjorie took the doll. She held it in her hands, and she felt the weight of everything that had occurred at Cypress Grove pressing down on her soul. "I will remember," she said. "I will carry this with me, and I will never forget." On October 15, 1835, Marjorie Ellison boarded a coach heading north. She was traveling under the assumed name of Margaret Ellsworth, a widow traveling to Philadelphia to live with distant relatives. She was dressed in mourning clothes. She wore a veil over her face. She carried very little luggage, only what seemed reasonable for a grieving woman leaving her home. As the coach pulled away from Cypress Grove for the final time, Marjorie looked back at the plantation house. She looked at the columns and the wide porches. She looked at the windows where she had spent 12 years in a pharmaceutical haze, trying to convince herself that she was mad. She looked at the grounds where enslaved people were working in the fields, continuing the work that had generated the wealth that had built this place. She understood that nothing had really changed. The Brethren was dead, but the system that had allowed the Brethren to exist was still alive. Slavery continued. Cruelty continued. The exploitation of human beings for profit continued. She had killed 9 men and her own father, but the structure that had created those men, that had encouraged their cruelty, that had rewarded their participation in evil, remained intact. But she also understood that she had done something significant. She had destroyed an organization dedicated to ritual murder. She had prevented future victims from being brought to that cellar. She had ensured that the men who participated in that organization would face consequences. She had demonstrated that resistance was possible, that systems could be made fragile from within, that power was not as absolute as it appeared. It was not everything, but it was something. Within a year, Cypress Grove Plantation had begun to deteriorate. Without William Ellison Jr. to manage it, without his presence to maintain discipline and order, the plantation fell into disrepair. The enslaved people who had worked the rice fields were sold off to other plantations or redistributed to family members. The main house was left standing but empty, its windows broken, its doors hanging open, its interior slowly being reclaimed by moisture and insects and the general decay that comes when human habitation ceases. By 1840, Cypress Grove was abandoned entirely. No one wanted to live there. People in the region spoke of the place in hushed tones, suggesting that it was cursed, that the ghosts of the men who had died there walked the grounds at night, that anyone foolish enough to attempt to rebuild or restore the plantation would face disaster. The stories were not entirely accurate, but they were not entirely false either. What was true was that the place carried the weight of what had occurred there. The knowledge of the rituals that had taken place in the cellar seemed to seep into the very ground. The memory of the men who had died there, 9 of them poisoned, seemed to linger in the humid air. By 1850, Cypress Grove was little more than a ruin. The main house had partially collapsed. The outbuildings had been consumed by fire or weather. The fields had been reclaimed by the marshes. The plantation had ceased to exist as a functioning entity and had become something else, a legend, a story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of accumulating too much power and the consequences of assuming that wealth and status could protect you from everything. Marjorie Ellison, or Margaret Ellsworth, as she was known in Philadelphia, lived quietly for 16 years. She took work as a teacher in a school for poor children. She lived in a small apartment. She attended church regularly, though she never spoke of her past. She spent her evenings reading or writing in a journal that she kept hidden in her room. To the people who knew her, she seemed like a woman who had suffered some great loss, a woman who was attempting to rebuild her life after tragedy, a woman who was devoted to service and to helping others. No one suspected that she was a murderer. No one suspected that she had orchestrated the deaths of 10 people. No one suspected that she was living with the weight of those deaths every moment of every day. In her journals, which were discovered after her death, Marjorie documented her thoughts about what she had done. She wrote about the moral ambiguity of her actions. She wrote about the fine line between justice and murder. She wrote about whether the deaths of the men of the Brethren had prevented future victims, or whether she had simply created new tragedy in an attempt to prevent existing tragedy. In one particularly revealing passage, she wrote, "I believed that by destroying those men, I was destroying evil. But I understand now that evil is not a thing that can be destroyed by killing. Evil is a system, a structure, a way of thinking about the world. The men of the Brethren did not create that system. They merely participated in it. By killing them, I have removed individual actors from the stage, but the stage itself remains. The theater of cruelty continues, with different actors in different locations. I have learned that real change does not come through violence, but through the transformation of consciousness. I have learned this too late." In another passage, she wrote, "I am not a murderer, and I am not a saint. I am simply a woman who did what she believed had to be done, given the information and resources available to her at the time. Whether that was correct or incorrect, I no longer know. I only know that I cannot undo what I have done, and I can only attempt to build a life that honors the lives of the people I have taken, that uses the remaining years granted to me to contribute something of value to the world." Over the decades following Marjorie's departure from South Carolina, the story of Cypress Grove became increasingly legendary. The details changed in the retelling. The names of those involved became confused. The circumstances of the deaths became more and more dramatic and fantastical. Some versions of the story suggested that Marjorie had used witchcraft. Others suggested that she had been possessed by a vengeful spirit. Still others suggested that she had been merely the instrument of a force larger than herself, divine justice, perhaps, or the collective will of the murdered seeking retribution. But in all versions of the story, the core truth remained. A woman had destroyed an organization that had been built on cruelty and ritual murder. A woman had decided that some evils had to be confronted directly. A woman had been willing to sacrifice her own soul to prevent the destruction of others. Among the enslaved communities of the South, the story of Cypress Grove spread like fire through dry grass. In the quarters where enslaved people lived, in the secret gatherings where they could speak freely, the story was retold again and again. It became a story about the possibility of resistance. It became a story about someone from inside the system choosing to oppose that system. It became a story about the fragility of power and the durability of resistance. When slavery was finally abolished, when the Civil War had torn the South apart, when Reconstruction had begun, the story of Cypress Grove took on new meaning. It was a story about what was possible when people decided that enough was enough. It was a story about the fact that systems of oppression could be made fragile from within. It was a story about courage and sacrifice and the terrible cost of resistance. The story of Marjorie Ellison and William Ellison Jr. is a work of fiction inspired by what are true historical figures and circumstances. William Ellison Jr. was a real man, one of the wealthiest free black planters in the antebellum South, known for his skill as a mechanic and his ruthlessness as an enslaver. His daughter's name was not Marjorie, and the Brethren of the Harvest was a fictional organization created for the purposes of this narrative. The specific circumstances of Cypress Grove, the hidden cellar, the rituals, the poisonings, are products of imagination, inspired by the contradictions and cruelties of American slavery, but not documented historical events. However, this narrative is grounded in historical truth. William Ellison Jr. did own enslaved people. He did use his ambiguous racial position to accumulate power and wealth. He did participate in the systems and structures that made slavery possible. The story of his life is a story about what happens when someone born into a position of marginalization chooses to adopt and perpetuate the systems that have oppressed people like himself. This narrative is offered not as history, but as a meditation on what was possible. It is a reminder that the past was not inevitable. It is a reminder that choices were made. It is a reminder that among those choices were some made by people without obvious power or authority that pushed back against systems of oppression, even when the victory was incomplete and the costs were terrible. Marjorie Ellison died in 1851, at the age of 40. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, though those who knew her suspected that what had truly killed her was the weight of what she had carried. She had spent 16 years attempting to build a life that was not defined by her crimes. She had spent 16 years attempting to contribute something of value to the world. She had spent 16 years attempting to forgive herself for the murders she had committed. She had not succeeded in any of these attempts, but she had tried, and in trying, she had left behind something more valuable than success. She had left behind a question for future generations to contemplate. What are the obligations of a person who finds themselves inside a system of evil? What are the limits of resistance? What are the acceptable costs of fighting against oppression? These questions remain unanswered. They remain urgent. They remain relevant to anyone who finds themselves in a position of complicity with injustice, regardless of the era in which they live. The story of Cypress Grove is told in this narrative as a meditation on these questions. It is not offered as a justification for violence. It is not offered as a suggestion for how resistance should be pursued. It is offered as a reminder that resistance has often taken forms that are morally ambiguous, that have required people to become capable of terrible things in order to oppose terrible things, that have left survivors carrying wounds that never fully heal. It is offered as a reminder of the cost of that resistance, and as a reminder of the cost of not resisting. In the years following the Civil War, when slavery had been abolished and the nation was attempting to reconstruct itself, the story of Cypress Grove began to fade from public consciousness. The plantation had become irrelevant. The man who had owned it was long dead. The woman who had destroyed him and his organization had vanished into history. But in the memories of the people who had been enslaved at Cypress Grove, the story persisted. In the oral traditions of the communities that had survived slavery, the story continued to be told. In the coded language of songs and stories and folklore, the truth of what had happened at Cypress Grove was preserved. And occasionally, in the decades that followed, when someone would ask about the ruins that remained of Cypress Grove, when someone would inquire about the plantation that had been abandoned so completely, older members of the community would tell the story. They would tell about the woman who had poisoned the men of the brethren. They would tell about the act of resistance that had come from within the system itself. They would tell about the price of that resistance and the triumph of it as well. The story did not change the course of history. It did not prevent the continued exploitation of black people in the South. It did not halt the machinery of oppression. But it did something subtler and perhaps more significant. It reminded people that resistance was possible. It reminded people that even in the most constrained circumstances, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, people could choose to oppose oppression. It reminded people that the system, for all its power, was not invulnerable to challenge from within. And that reminder, passed down through generations in whispered conversations and coded stories, became a kind of power in itself. It became a resource that could be drawn upon when moments of choice arrived. It became proof that change was possible, even when the immediate costs of achieving that change seemed impossibly high. This is the story of Marjorie Ellison. This is the story of Cypress Grove. This is the story of what happened when a woman decided that justice mattered more than safety, that truth mattered more than comfort, and that sometimes the only way to resist evil is to become temporarily something dark and dangerous yourself. It is a story without easy answers. It is a story that asks difficult questions. It is a story that suggests that resistance has often been undertaken by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and that the legacies of that resistance are far more complex and morally ambiguous than any simple narrative of good versus evil can capture. It is offered here as a reminder of that complexity, and as a reminder of the cost.